Okay. Okay. I think we're live. So, hello and welcome to the last segment of the Immigration and Refugee Rights Day of UConn's first inaugural Human Rights Symposium. My name is Emily, and I'll be leading us into this event, which will consist of a presentation on the asylum process in the U.S., as well as a Q&A given by UConn Law Immigration Clinic's Valeria Gomez, who also helped on the previous Know Your Rights event, who I will now introduce. So Valeria Gomez is William R. Davis Clinical Teaching Fellow in the Asylum and Human Rights Clinic, where law students represent refugees who have fled persecution and are seeking protection in the U.S. She regularly speaks on issues related to asylum and immigration law. So Professor Gomez previously worked in her hometown of Knoxville, Tennessee as an Equal Justice Works Fellow with Volunteer Immigrant Defense Advocates, a nonprofit legal services organization she co-founded in 2016. So as an attorney with VIDA, she represented recently arrived unaccompanied immigrant children in removal proceedings, mentored new immigration practitioners, and gave frequent presentations to attorneys, law students, and community groups. During much of her time at VIDA, Professor Gomez was the only pro bono attorney representing children in immigrant courts in East Tennessee, an area encompassing 32 counties and over 13,000 square miles. In recognition of her work, the Greater Knoxville Business Journal named Professor Gomez to its 2018 40 Under 40 list of young leaders making a difference. Before co-founding VIDA, Professor Gomez was a clinical lecturer at the University of Tennessee College of Law's Immigration Clinic, where she co-taught the Immigration Law Clinic and engaged in direct representation of unaccompanied minors in removal proceedings. Professor Gomez earned her JD from the University of Tennessee College of Law. Immediately after law school, she practiced employment law for 2 years in Nashville, Tennessee. She has spoken at multiple events outlining intersecting topics such as law and gender with specifics in immigration and asylum. In this presentation, we can expect from her to define asylum within the U.S., the steps to achieving it, and why it might be even more difficult than it appears. Lastly, there will be a Q&A segment following this presentation, so get your questions ready, and I will give it over to her.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. I do have a question. I'm seeing that in the sharing content, I've got share folder and new whiteboard, and screen doesn't show up, but sharing screen. So I do have slides that might make some of this a little easier to process because it is very complicated. So if there were a way that I could share my screen, I think that would make it more helpful.
So you can definitely share your screen, hopefully as a panelist with the share button. And maybe you could just share your files straight from your computer, or I don't know why it's not giving us a share content option. Oh geez.
It's all right. We are figuring out a new platform together.
Oh my goodness. So are you able to share the file from your computer so that the slides appear?
Let me see what happens when I share the file. Just a moment.
If you'd like, you can also send me the presentation through email, and I can go through the slides for you if you'd like as well.
That can work. We'll do that. All right, one moment, everyone. All right. Just a moment. All right, I have just sent that. So while we wait for that presentation to go through, and Diana, what I'll do is I'll just let you know when I'm ready to move on to the next slide. But I want to thank you for inviting me to talk about this topic, particularly because it's something that is so in the news, and yet so few people, I think, fully understand what the process looks like, what asylum even means, what asylum even gets you here in the United States, and what our laws actually say about who we're supposed to be allowing access to this process. So I think it's really crucially important for people to, I always joke with people about how they have hot takes without bothering to read up on things. And I feel like immigration and asylum in particular is one of those areas where everyone has an opinion, but very few people know what the process looks like. And I'm willing to say would be able to navigate the process on their own if they had to do so. So for today, one of the things that I'm going to be doing, besides explaining, I kind of want to talk about the origins of where our asylum law comes from here in the United States, like where it came from and why it exists, and then start talking about generally what asylum is. So the things that you have to prove, what it gets you here in terms of like protection from deportation, and things that can prevent you from accessing asylum, because even that is going to be really illustrative about, when we're talking about process, part of it is what you have to prove, and that is kind of, as we'll see, quite a bit. The second thing is going to be actually exploring generally what that process looks like, and seeing, first of all, the fact that there's more than one process available depending on your circumstances, and hopefully also talking about the types of things that you have to present, how you present them, what resources people have available to them as a matter of right, and what resources they can try to take advantage of if they can. And then briefly at the end, before we move on to questions, we are Emily, I see that you messaged me. I sent it to Diana, but if she hasn't gotten it, let me know. I think you did email.
Yeah, just let me know because you can always also send it to me.
Oh, you got it. Okay. The last thing that we'll be talking about is, generally speaking, what does the situation look like right now? There has been a lot of obviously negative action taken against the asylum process during the Trump administration, but one of the things that I'll point out is that some of these things, many of these things that are burdens on the process and burdens on people seeking protection, have existed well before Trump, under Democrat and Republican administrations, and some of the most burdensome bars to getting asylum, including the CDC mandate that we'll talk about near the end of the presentation, are still in effect right now with Biden as president. So I'm hoping that that can give some good context to what we'll talk about. And Diana, if you could actually skip this slide and the next slide, because I've already sort of done the overview intro, and then we can step into, perfect, what the origins of asylum law are. So what is asylum? What are refugees? Those topics get thrown around, and I think it's helpful to give context to what the law is supposed to protect to understand where it comes from. So all of this presentation is going to be very broad strokes because we could spend hours on any one of these slides, and in fact do at the law school. But the origins of asylum law as it relates to the United States come from basically the aftermath of what happened in World War II. So in World War II, as I'm sure everyone knows who's tuning in, we had a genocide and persecution of a variety of people, but most notably, or most perhaps recognize people of the Jewish faith or people who were ethnically Jewish, but really of also ethnic minorities, and a number of people who were considered, undesirables, in quotes. And without a sort of international agreement or obligation of whether we were supposed to accept certain people who were fleeing persecution or fleeing torture, what ended up happening is many of these people ended up without a place to go because they couldn't otherwise qualify for admission under the immigration laws of the different countries that they were trying to enter for protection. And so that obviously was catastrophic, and many people died as a result of that lack of a system. So the UN ended up putting together, drafting a convention, which is known as the 1951 Refugee Convention, which basically set forth the sort of standard rules for any countries that agreed to sign on and agreed to be bound by that convention, that said, okay, now that we've signed on to this, we obligate ourselves under international law that we are not going to turn away people if they can meet the following requirements. And we'll go through what those requirements are. But if people are fleeing persecution because of their political opinion, religion, national origin, race, or membership in a particular social group, we are not going to send them back because we have this obligation to human rights. And so what ends up happening, the original iteration of this was mostly oriented to people that had been persecuted during World War II or had been displaced during the aftermath of World War II. But in 1967, everyone came back and said, okay, let's update this now so that it applies to anyone regardless of where they're from. And it will apply to any of the countries that agree to sign on. So interestingly enough, the United States did not actually agree to sign on until the late 70s. So we weren't bound by this for quite a while, but eventually we did. And eventually the Senate ratified basically what is a treaty. And therefore in the United States, Congress passed the Refugee Act of 1980. And the sole purpose and the stated purpose of Congress to do so was to make sure that we were in line with our international obligations as it related to human rights, and specifically this document. So that's an important thing to bring up, because it's important to like sort of recognize, what is the point of this? Why did this happen in the first place? But also, where did our laws come from? Because we should always be looking back to the goals of what of why we have these laws when we think about what are the effects that these laws are having on the ground. So we can move on to the next slide and start talking about what asylum actually is. So if you could, perfect. So what is asylum? What are the things that you have to prove in order to show that you are an asylee? And what is asylum? What does that get you? So people that request asylum, what they are requesting is permission to stay in the United States and not be sent back to the countries that they are fleeing. Asylum, and we'll talk about what those different ways are, but essentially what asylum gets you is permission to stay in the United States, and eventually, if you win asylum, you have a path to lawful permanent resident status, what some people call a green card, and then eventually, if people are interested and eligible, they have access to citizenship. So it's a way of staying in the country for safety, all the while having a pathway to fully integrate yourself into the fabric of the United States. There's other forms of relief that are similar that come from the same treaty, from the same convention, that get people a few less rights while still letting them stay in the United States. But for the purpose of keeping it simple, we'll focus on asylum because these other things are relatively similar. So the first thing about asylum, which I think is really important for people to understand, is that the way that you request it is by being in the United States or at the US border. So a lot of times you'll hear people say, I wish people would do it the right way. And it's important to note that is how you do it. You either have to be already in the United States, or you have to be knocking at the door at the border and say, hi, I know that like I don't have permission, I don't have a paper that says I have permission to enter the country, but please don't send me back, and please give me an interview because I need to request asylum protection. There is no such thing as the asylum visa that you can go get at the consulate. There isn't such thing as like an outside of the country process. So you have to be in the United States or at the US border. That's the correct way to request asylum. And then that's the only way to be eligible for asylum. You can't request it from outside of the United States. Beyond that, what you have to show is that you're unable or unwilling to return to your country of origin. And you have to show that the reason that you are unable or unwilling to return is because you've either suffered past persecution or you have a well-founded fear of being persecuted in the future. And what constitutes persecution is actually a relatively high bar. Things like mere harassment or discrimination are not going to be enough. That's not what asylum is meant to protect. And we can talk about whether we think that's fair, but as the law stands, it has to be a relatively high level of physical or mental harm. And so you can prove that you've either suffered that or that you have an objectively reasonable fear that that's going to happen to you in the future. But not all harm is going to count. the persecution you suffered in the past or the persecution that you think you're going to suffer has to be on account of having a protected characteristic, which sometimes in the legal field we call a protected ground. And that is to say, you have to tie the harm that you're afraid of to being in possession of one of these characteristics. There has to be like a but-for connection. And those things are a person's race, a person's nationality, which can sometimes include things like ethnic groups, and people that share linguistic characteristics, like, for example, the Roma people would be something that would count under that category. On account of your religion or your refusal to espouse a particular religion or your refusal to have any religion, your political opinion, which essentially can mean something pretty broad, and it can be like your opinion is either about a particular government or about the way that your country is being governed, or membership in a particular social group, which is like a sort of a catch-all that is judges still struggle to figure out what that means, because the law itself, as it's written down, the statute, doesn't give a specific definition for it. But it's something, essentially, what it means is that you're a part of a group, and everyone in that group shares a characteristic that they can't change or they shouldn't have to change because it's fundamental to who they are. So things like gender, things like sexual orientation, those are examples of things that are unchangeable. Family relationships, things like that. And then beyond that, it has to be a group that is particular, so there's clear boundaries around the group, and the society in their home countries would recognize that sort of as a distinct and separate group from the whole. If you're already feeling like you've got a headache and you're confused, that is completely appropriate, because it is in and of itself confusing. And it's one example of how this process is difficult for people that don't have access to lawyers or who don't speak English. So, okay, let's say that you have shown that you've suffered past persecution. You've actually shown that it's because of one of these 5 protected grounds, one of these 5 protected characteristics. And so the next thing you have to show is either that the government is the person that is persecuting you, like it's the government in your home country, or that it's a group, if it's a private group or a private person, that it's someone that the government is not able or not willing to protect you from. Because the idea is that asylum is for people that don't have access to help in their home countries. And so there's that requirement of showing with proof that it's highly unlikely that the government would not be able to, because they just don't have the resources or the capabilities, or that they're not interested in helping you. Beyond that, there's a list of things that can prevent you from getting asylum, and those are what's referred to as mandatory bars, which means that even if you prove all the things I've already talked about, triggering any of those bars will automatically prevent you from being able to qualify for asylum. And you, beyond that, have to be granted asylum as a matter of discretion. And so that means that whoever is in charge of adjudicating the case, of deciding the case, even if you show all of those things and show that you're not required to be denied asylum, you still have to show that you deserve asylum because fill in the blank, because you're a good person and asylum should be granted to you. So those are all of the legal characteristics related to that. And if we move on to the next slide, we can dig in a little bit deeper as to what some of those things mean. So there's some things that are benchmark requirements that also make trying to navigate through the process difficult. And the first is that there's actually in law, in statute, there is a particular standard for what it means to be found credible, believable, and what you have to do to prove your case. So and this is in a statute that's called the Real ID Act of 2005. And so essentially, one of the things that makes asylum really difficult is that every asylum adjudicator, whether it's an asylum officer or an immigration court judge, has in their head things that they imagine have to be present for someone to be credible. And one of those things tends to be the consistency between all of the evidence. So that means consistency between any statements that you might have given to the Border Patrol or to any other official of the United States that might exist in a written record, consistency between like whatever statements you submitted on your own behalf or of witnesses that might have like helped you write up statements so that you could support your claim, consistency between any evidence that you submitted to show what the conditions are in your country to kind of back up your version of what things are, and also your live testimony. And one thing that comes to mind is that also things like dates and order that things happen, many of the people that are requesting asylum have suffered trauma, right? Suffering past persecution will have a traumatic, is a form of trauma. And therefore, a lot of people's might be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the characteristics of post-traumatic stress disorder is that you have difficulty with memory because traumatic memories get encoded differently in your brain. Or it can be really traumatic to remember those things, so you don't sort of produce the memory in the same way that you produce non-traumatic memories. Things like PTSD or depression, which is also something that is commonly found in asylum seekers for obvious reasons, can affect the way that you present. So you might have like a really flat affect because of, as a result of your PTSD and depression. And the asylum officer or immigration judge might decide that you don't seem like someone who's been through this because you're not expressing enough. So those are the things that are sort of overarching benchmark requirements that you have to have in order to win asylum. And there's a few other things that when I was talking about things that can mandatorily just render you ineligible, I have a long list of things. I won't talk about all of them for the sake of time. But one of the things that's really, that makes things really difficult is failing to file your asylum application within 1 year of your entry. You know, it's not necessarily clear whether people are ever told that this is the case, you know, if they encounter Border Patrol. And it's likely that they're never told by the government if they enter in a lawful manner, or if they enter without ever having any encounters with the US government. And so you can imagine if you don't already know that that requirement is there and you're having trouble adjusting to a new country, you're having trouble because you don't speak English, or you're having trouble because you can't get access to an attorney, a lot of people don't realize that they only have 365 days once they enter to file an asylum application, and that in and of itself can render them ineligible. And they can try to get other forms of similar relief that don't get them as much in terms of benefits and protection. But that's something that it's a requirement that's existed since the 90s, actually, and it's made it really difficult. Another thing is whether somebody offered what's referred to, and I put this in quotes, material support of terrorist organizations. And the reason I say material is because the way that this requirement has been interpreted by courts that are, you know, implementing the cases is that really any kind of support that you give to someone who's considered a terrorist organization, and that term is also very broadly defined, can count against you and knock you out of eligibility. That includes if you did it under duress. So if someone kidnapped your son and then said, you know, I'm going to kill your son unless you provide my soldiers a place to sleep at night, that can be something that is considered material support of a terrorist organization if, you know, those soldiers are considered to be a part of a terrorist organization, regardless of whether it happened under duress. And so you can imagine, again, that this is the kind of circumstance that you would think we're trying to protect people from, but those really technical interpretations of these standards makes something that's meant to be generous something that is quite restrictive. And the only other thing I will note is sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, well, you know, we don't even know who these people are, or we hear, particularly during the Trump administration, this depiction of asylum seekers as criminals. And one thing that I'll note is that every asylum seeker that goes through the process has to go through a background check that involves fingerprints and photographs. They cannot be granted asylum without it. So it's actually, you know, I'm not necessarily of the mind that we have to be tracking everyone all the time, but to the extent that you are concerned about knowing who's in the country, it actually is, people do not get this relief without agreeing to go through that process. All right, so moving on to the next slide, because I know we're running a little bit short on time. So the next thing we're going to talk about is how you seek asylum the right way. What is this way, this process that we keep talking about? So let's look at the next slide, which is going to be terrifying. This is an overview of the asylum process. The three different colors, or I guess the four different colors, are four different ways in which somebody can request asylum. And so we're going to break that down a little bit more in a second. And again, this is all an extreme overview. But this goes to show you how it's different if you entered the country through the border and were about to get kicked out. It's different if you entered the country with a visa and you're still in status. It's different if if you somehow get involved in an immigration enforcement process and then have to go to immigration court. And it's different if you've already been deported before. So all of these different colors stand for a different process, and you'll see they're interrelated because you can jump from one to another. So we're not going to go through all of this in detail by any means, but when we talk about the right way, this is what I want people to understand: is it's a mess and it's difficult to navigate. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll talk about the first general way, which is something that's referred to as affirmative asylum. And so affirmative asylum is a non-adversarial form of requesting asylum. And what that means is that as opposed to being like in court with an opposing counsel and a judge with a gavel, it's something that you request from an agency that is going to interview you sort of in an office in front of a computer, and not necessarily in a cross-examining, like, isn't it true that way, but more of like an interview to try to understand your situation. And this is something that is available for people who basically have not been caught up in the immigration enforcement process, which is to say ICE never got them or the Border Patrol never got them and then tried to kick them out of the country. So this can include people that have visa status now, like somebody with a student visa. This can include somebody who might have entered without ever being inspected, who's been living under the radar since they entered the United States. And this might be somebody who might have entered with permission, but then overstayed or did something to change their conditions and then couldn't, may not be in status, but still has not ever been like called to immigration court. So one of the things that this tends to be a more, I don't want to say easier, but a less strenuous way of requesting asylum. But one of the things that makes this difficult is that right now, the way that they have this is it's set up in a last in, first out process, which means that your interviews, as soon as your application is received, the office is trying to schedule you really quickly. And it could be in a matter of like a month. Given all the things I talked about that you need to corroborate, you can imagine how it might be difficult for you to get all of your stuff together and be ready to get to an asylum interview in a month. So that's one of the things that's complicated about the affirmative process. But if we move on to the next slide, I'll talk about what is referred to as a defensive process. And this is generally what's going to be the process for the people that we hear about mostly in the news, the people that are approaching the border and asking for asylum at the border. Generally, what happens if somebody comes without permission to the United States is that they would be subject to something that's called expedited removal. And what that means is the Customs and Border Patrol gets you, interviews you, fingerprints you, and says, you don't have permission to be here, and immediately kicks you out of the country. So you don't have access to an immigration judge, usually at that step. An exception is if you say, can you please just screen me for asylum and see if I can have a day in court because I can't go back. And so what ends up happening for those individuals is that after they're encountered at the border, they're usually detained until they can get what's called a credible fear interview. And that is basically, it's almost like a pre-screening for people so that someone who is an asylum officer and familiar with asylum laws can interview them and get a general sense for why they're afraid, and get a general sense for, if they can prove everything that's here, and if the story seems logical to me, they will have an opportunity to present a full-blown case in the United States. So assuming that people can pass that process, which can be very difficult, and you don't have access, many people don't have access to a lawyer, you certainly aren't appointed one at this stage or ever, then some people might be released with conditions, which means that they either have to check in at an ICE office, or they have to wear a ankle monitor, or they might get out on bond if they pay a certain amount of money. Some people are never released from immigration detention, which means they have to try to gather and prepare their case from within a detention center, which most of the time is not really distinguishable from a jail. So assuming, for people that are released or people that are detained, eventually what they get is a hearing in immigration court. And so we'll actually, in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next slide so that we can talk about what happens once you go through all this process and you get a hearing for a defensive claim in immigration court. The first thing that makes this difficult is people have to follow former procedural rules. So there's rules of procedure, there's deadlines for the way you turn stuff in, there's specific orders about copies and hole punching and all of these very technical things that you think about court. Those often apply here, which again, without an attorney, can be difficult to figure out even where the rules are, and then to try to make sure that you're following all those rules. The second thing is that it's an adversarial process, which means that you have an opposing counsel. You can see here in the picture, you've got two tables. And so you have an ICE attorney that is objecting, that is doing harsh cross-examinations, whose job is actually, I guess not formally, but in my experience, their job is to show why you should be given asylum. And so very few times will you see an ICE attorney sort of agree, yes, let's give this person asylum, I'm not going to fight it. And you have a judge who, depending on where you are, can sometimes feel like they're your second set of opposing counsel. You don't have a right in any of this process to an appointed attorney. So you have a right to try to find your own attorney. And some people are lucky and able to afford an attorney. Attorneys for asylum can be very expensive, and it's because it's a lot of work. It's not, I guess there are unscrupulous attorneys sometimes there, but many times they're expensive because it's really hard to present one of these cases and it requires a lot of work. Sometimes people are able to find attorneys at nonprofit organizations, but you can imagine that those nonprofit organizations can be very saturated with people that need help, so they can't help everyone. And beyond that, if they can't get access to an attorney, they have to try to do this by themselves. So they sit at that table by themselves and try to appoint whatever proof they need by themselves, and try to present everything else. There is language interpretation in these hearings, but any documents that are submitted have to be in English. So again, translation of many documents, either you find someone that can do it and you hope they did a good job, or sometimes you can pay someone to do it, but that's another expense. And depending on how much proof you have in a different language, the documents are not going to be accepted and they cannot be considered by a judge if they're not in English. And this actually includes, by the way, if let's say we have a Spanish speaking asylum seeker and low key, everyone knows that the immigration judge also speaks Spanish, the immigration judge still can't consider those documents because the rules say that they have to be in English. So in the interest of time, we'll leave it there. But one of the things that I do want to point out is when I say that there's not a right to an appointed attorney, I mean for anyone. So children who are unaccompanied also do not get attorneys and have to try to figure out through caretakers or whatever other resources exist to try to navigate this process on their own. So let's move on to the next slide. And we'll actually, we'll move on to the next slide in the interest of time because I know we're running short on time. The previous slide is just to show, and I'll just tell it to you while we rest on this slide, to show the effect of having an immigration attorney in these cases. And so in studies that have been found about in the fiscal year of 2019, they found that only 16% of asylum seekers who did not have an attorney were successful in their claims. And there's a variety of reasons for why that is, including that the definition of what's allowable keeps getting thinner and more restrictive as time progresses, but partly it's because of all of those complications that I've mentioned before. That doubles for people that are represented, which shows that it's still a relatively low amount, but essentially, the fact that the government makes no effort to even connect children with attorneys starts to show you really how we start getting divorced, I think, from what the purpose of the law was, and we get muddled down into really technical stuff. But to close out the presentation, here's a list of policies that in the past have impeded access to asylum. And I've got crossed out, most of these were things that were implemented by the Trump administration, but not all of them. And I've crossed out things that either were shut down by courts when somebody sued and said this shouldn't be allowed, or that have otherwise been retracted by the current administration. But there's a few things that are still, that you'll see are still there. So some of people might have heard about the Remain in Mexico policy that was implemented during the Trump administration, which basically meant that when people knocked on the door, the government said, okay, we'll come back and we'll give you a screening interview the way we have to, but then rather than hold you here, either in detention or letting you go in the United States, we're going to send you back to Mexico. You figure out what you do to get back, but we'll let you know when to come back. That was really detrimental. We could spend a whole hour on just what a human rights violation that entire process was. That is in the process of being reversed. However, not all of the people that were subject to that policy have been back in the United States yet since the Biden administration. So that's been a slow reversal. One of the things that has happened since well before Trump and is still happening now is that there has been a reinterpretation of what the law is. And when I say that, you might remember that I mentioned things like particular social group in like the statute that Congress passed. So this is something that's really common in our American common law system, is that the legislators can't anticipate every single way that what they write down is going to need to be interpreted. Like there's so much gray area. That's just the way life is. And so in our American system, there's something that they call common law and precedent. And basically that means we're gonna let judges, certain level of judges, say, okay, well, this is what Congress said the law is, and this is the situation that I have. So in this situation, I'm gonna say that when this, and this present, what the statute means is X. So that gives people that are, and we could get a little bit into the weeds about like who is allowed to do it in immigration, but let's just say the agency that's allowed to issue those precedent decisions is not in the judicial branch. It's in the executive branch, which means it's part of whatever administration is in power. And they're removed from these like lifetime appointed judges that are set forth in the Constitution. So what's ended up happening, and again, since well before Trump, is that those vague terms that aren't specified in the statute, they get defined smaller to mean something smaller and smaller and smaller. And sometimes you really do get the sense that they're trying to exclude a particular group of people who they just don't want to get asylum for whatever reason, whether they're afraid about the floodgates opening or whether just for political foreign relations reasons they don't want to set precedent in place. But the more you restrict what you say the law means, the harder it is for people to qualify for asylum. And the harder it is for someone without an attorney to figure out what these other precedential rules are, because you kind of have to know how to research it. The last thing that I'll say, and I'll leave time for questions after this, is that all of this stuff that I've talked about, how the border process works right now, is almost completely shut down. So when COVID-19 happened last year, or I guess we're still going through it, but in spring of last year, the Trump administration, through the CDC, implemented a mandate under what's referred to as Title 42 of the US Code, which essentially said, because of health reasons, we are shutting down the border, the southern border. People cannot come in, period. You're not getting your credible fear interviews. We're not going to like try to detain you. You just do not have access. It's closed. During the Trump administration, they did this across the board, including with unaccompanied children. And that was found to be against the law because there is an exception through some laws, some different laws that talk about how we're supposed to protect unaccompanied children, primarily to protect them from human trafficking. So the process was reversed through the Biden administration only as it relates to unaccompanied children. So when we talk about like this flood of unaccompanied children, and I don't like that term, but an increase in unaccompanied children coming to the border, some of this has to do with people that have been waiting to come in for a long time, and their family members are making the very difficult decision to let their children move forward without them, so that they can start having access to protection, because these conditions under which people were remaining in Mexico were extremely dangerous and really bad for children. And it also includes people who might be coming with someone who's not a parent, so a grandparent or a cousin or an aunt, they're not considered parents, and so they end up getting separated from their family members, even if they are still caretakers. And then we call that person an unaccompanied child, and they go through the process alone. So that Title 42 mandate that shut down the border, that's still in place. That hasn't moved. The Biden administration has gotten a lot of pushback because of that. But as it relates to the southern border, it's still completely closed. So that is, in a nutshell, the asylum process. And I know I talked very quickly because there's just so much to say. And I'll maybe we can get more into some details with the questions that come in.
Yes, I would definitely like to. I know I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to pick out the most important ones. Your presentation was so informative. I definitely did not know so many of the things that were on it. So firstly, I would like to know from you, as someone practicing law, how feasible do you think that the asylum process actually is?
I think it needs to be restructured because, as you can see, particularly for someone who doesn't have an attorney, but even for someone who does, it's a very difficult process to navigate. The rules seem to be changing all the time. And the restrictions that are in place, like the one-year deadline, I think fail to take into account the conditions under which people arrive in a different country when they're fleeing something. They don't necessarily have all of their things in order, because when you flee for safety, you don't, call your broker and ask if he can send you a copy of your contract, right? You just get out. So I think it's, I think we're kidding ourselves if we tell ourselves that our process is really structured in a way that's meant to protect people. I don't think that the complication has always necessarily been intentional, but in any event, I still think it's extremely complicated and difficult to navigate. And so I think a lot of people are falling by the wayside. And unfortunately, when it comes to asylum, that means that lives are in danger through this process.
Thank you for that answer. So for a follow-up, what do you think in like a perfect world, a perfect country, that like what are some simple ways to make the system better?
So oh my goodness, so many. One thing, I mean, we could talk in terms of increments, or we can talk about perfection. And I think the perfection question is such a large scope question that can't be answered in a short amount of time. But one of the things that I think is really important is the complex system is over formalized, and people don't have access to attorneys, and children don't have access to attorneys. And so I think without having a system in place that allows people that are seeking asylum, or if you didn't want to be so broad, that allows people who are detained, who can't get outside of their detention center, who may be limited in how many phone calls they can make outside of their jail setting, and who may be held, I mean, you don't get to control where they hold you, so who may be held across the country from like their support systems or from where there are a lot of attorneys. It just makes it a really uphill battle. And in the time that I've practiced, I've met one person who was detained who got herself some relief. And I mean, she was the exception to the rule, and frankly, the exception to prove the rule, because it's so difficult. So I would say access to counsel. I would say things like the one-year deadline were specifically just put in place to keep people out. And I think that is unacceptable and does not take into consideration the conditions under which people are trying to exist. Yeah, I mean, so many. The credibility standards, I think, are also a joke and not grounded in reality. We could talk for hours.
Thank you. So another question that I'd like to know is, to the best of your knowledge, can you speak on how even COVID-19 has affected this process and asylum seekers?
Yeah, so in a number of ways. Obviously, I talked about the border shutdown mandate. That's a pretty clear way, because the justification for that, which doctors have actually and people have said, like, this is actually not justified, but the justification has been that because of public health, they cannot undergo this like credible fear screening process, and they have to just completely shut down that process. But another one has to do with like what's happening, the other ways in which COVID-19 is affecting just our country. So, you know, a downturn in the economy or illness resulting in lack of employment might affect the access to counsel that you have, because it's hard to afford things like consultation with an attorney, or things like, you know, being able to afford, if you have a family member back home who you need to send you copies of birth certificates, all that costs money. If you need an expert witness who can talk about like the political realities of the situation in your country, all that costs money. So the more you make it difficult for people, and we know that people without legal status have not been able to take advantage of some of the resources that have been available to people to help them get through this stuff, you know, that all affects them, I think, the strongest. The other things too is that delays. So the asylum office, for people that are going through that affirmative process, they closed for a large part of 2020, which meant that people that were waiting for interviews, you know, weren't really sure when they were going to get rescheduled, and that all set the system back a little bit more. But I think that's actually a better outcome than what happened in the immigration courts. So the immigration courts, they never fully, the Department of Justice, which is the agency that administers and looks over these courts, they never fully closed down immigration courts. So what ended up happening is that different courts like across the country were hodgepodge deciding, oh, we're going to close today out of an abundance of caution. Oh, we're going to close today and we're closing tomorrow because there was an infection. And it was completely unorganized. It's still happening, by the way. But beyond that, sometimes they were, especially at the beginning, they were being announced on Twitter. Like they were just getting on Twitter, and that's how they were announcing that immigration court was canceled for that day. So one thing to keep in mind is something that people don't often know, because it doesn't really make sense, is that there isn't necessarily like an immigration court in every state or in every county. Some people have to travel really long distances to get to court. And so where I used to practice, where I used to live in East Tennessee, we had to drive like 6 to 8 hours, depending on where you were in that region, to get to court. So you can imagine if someone like last minute cancels all of the immigration court hearings, you already made travel arrangements. Like you already got all of your witnesses on board to go to the hearing. You might not have Twitter, or you might not like be able to read the Twitter that's only put out in English. So it was really, really disruptive for people that were trying to keep up with the system, because it was just, I think the better thing to do would have been to just shut down hearings until further notice, until it was safe. Because the other thing that was happening is that people were getting sick in immigration court, period. Particularly when things were really out of control and we didn't know that we were supposed to wear masks and we didn't know what happened. They were only canceling court if they had reason to. And we know that no one was supposed to be out. Like we had stay-at-home orders, and people were still being made to go to their court hearings. So, you know, I think that was a really detrimental and I think really harsh way of treating people who were, you know, just trying to follow that process, trying to follow the rules, and having to figure out how to stay safe, because if you don't show up to immigration court, you lose your rights and you get deported.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for that. So last question from me is going to be, do you have hope for this new administration to provide concrete solutions for the asylum process and for the people going through it?
So I have guarded hope. You can't be in this field long term if you don't have hope that things will get more fair. There have been some things that have been positive changes. You know, I think if the Trump administration had stayed in power, things would have gotten very dark, very dark. And certainly we see Biden is walking back some of those policies, but as we can see, a lot of those policies aren't being walked back. And so something that, for example, was really disappointing was that initially earlier, I guess it was last week, Biden announced that he was not going to increase the number of refugees that were going to be allowed from a different area. So these are people that have to prove the same things, but they are sort of outside of the country and they get vetted through other agencies. And the reason that he said he was doing it was because of what's going on at the border. But that was all an optics thing because, as I've explained, those are two completely different processes that happen very independent from each other. And so it was really disappointing because it was sort of a lot of the same. I think there is a possibility to put in place more clear definitions of what some of these wishy-washy terms mean so that people can stop restricting them and so that they're sort of set in place. And I would hope that there is a push for legislative changes that make the asylum process easier, and that's not entirely in Biden's hands because it's a different it's Congress. But one of the things that I think the Trump administration made really clear is that unlike other areas of the law, immigration is one in which the agencies, which is to say the people that are accountable to the president, have an incredible amount of power, an incredible amount of discretion for deciding how they're going to manage the system. So I'm hoping that they make use of everything in their power to try to not only right the wrongs of the last administration, but really try again to think back about why we have the system in the first place, and make it a system that reflects that and reflects what we claim to be a commitment to human rights.
Thank you so much for all of your insights. It was super informative. I know I learned a lot. So yeah, thank you again for coming and for presenting. So I'm going to hand it over to Diana for our concluding remarks for our day's event, which is super exciting.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you so much for joining us here today. Thank you to our guest speakers who took the time to speak on some incredibly important topics. Also, a massive thank you to my committee members, Priya Mistry and Emily Luck, as well as Neha, Arushi, and Irene for their support. All of our events will be uploaded to our website by tonight in case you missed any of them. Please tune in tomorrow and Friday for the final days of the symposium. Tomorrow we'll focus on Indigenous rights and decolonization, and Friday we'll focus on gender and sexuality-based rights. All right, so thank you again for joining us and have a good rest of the day.